Excellent. Hello, everyone. My name is Josep Grau-Bové, Associate Professor in Heritage Science and Deputy Director of the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. You are all very welcome to this online lecture, the first of our guest lecture series for this year, part of the ISH Academy, the online home of ISH, where we do talks, courses, and general outreach. Let me just start with a little bit of housekeeping rules, and then I'll introduce our speaker. It's very simple, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with how this works. The lecture will last for 1 hour in total, and this will include Bill's lecture and then around 15 minutes or 10 minutes of Q&A. The main means of interaction with the speaker is through the Q&A function. So you will see at the bottom of your screens, there's the Q&A button. You can type there your questions at any time during the lecture. And then towards the end, when we start the Q&A session, I will ask those questions to Bill. I will read them myself. So it's really useful if when you write your question, we are always grateful if you can say a few things about yourself, such as your institution, if applicable. And this always helps the speaker know where the question is coming from. That said, let's begin. I will introduce Bill. So it's our pleasure to start our guest lecture series with a presentation from Bill Bordass, a scientist who learned about architectural, planning, and engineering projects at the multi-skilled practice RMJM in London, and led its building services, environmental, and energy consultancy. In 1984, he set up his own to focus on how buildings, and that's new, existing, and historic buildings, perform in use, including research, troubleshooting, and providing advice. In the late 90s, he helped to set up the Usable Buildings, which disseminates information on building performance in use and its implications for policy and practice. Bill has been a friend and collaborator of ISH since its inception, and in his long career, he has seen the evolution of the field of sustainable building practice. So we are very keen to hear his views today. The great number of attendance and registrations is evidence of how current and interesting this topic is. That's everything from me. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks very much. Screen sharing has failed.
All right.
Oh, here it comes.
It works well, yes.
Have you got the screen now?
I see it perfectly, yeah.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for attending and for the introduction. I'm going to think about what we need to do in terms of energy and carbon retrofits on buildings, and whether the way things are pointing at the moment makes sense for heritage and traditional buildings. So essentially what I want to do is paint in some background from when I started paying some attention to this with historic England, with English heritage about 20 years ago, and various things were going on, and then have a look back at that from today, and then try to look forward to tomorrow in what people think we need to do, or what we might actually need to do, and particularly whether we have a sort of spectrum of possibilities for tackling things rather than a one-size-fits-all type of approach. And then I want to step back a bit to think about whether the whole way we go about things, particularly in the global north, needs to change substantially for the future. And then if I've got time, or if somebody asks a question about it, I may talk about the ingredients of what we call a people first approach, which is the opposite. So rather than starting from the fabric and working in, which tends to be the conventional wisdom for improving the energy and carbon performance of buildings. What happened if you started with the people and worked out? So a bit of history first. It was clear with the new millennium that things needed to be done, and had been quite a lot of activity in the 90s in terms of laying the foundations for the understanding of building performance and decarbonisation. But, you know, were we sure if changes would hit, particularly heritage and traditional buildings, that they'd hit in the right place, or might there be unintended consequences? Because we've got a problem. Our policymakers seem to think that buildings are all about construction and the construction industry, and we don't have enough knowledge of how they actually work, either for policymakers or for the majority of designers, builders, clients, managers, etc. Of course, with very notable exceptions, particularly the people who work in the heritage area, which I'll come to a bit later. So this is based on a Green Building of the Year award winner office about 30 years ago, where there was a big performance gap, as it's now called, between what the designers thought this new building was going to use and what it actually used. And what I found at the turn of the century was that nobody really, in spite of all the imperatives to save energy and carbon, very few people understood how the building performed in use. So I had this cartoon done with the facilities manager and the client and the architect and the builder, you know, all with blindfolds on. I got this wrong. We should have had a policymaker on the ground with a telescope with an eye patch at the end of it, because policymakers are not very good at it either. So there's a whole culture where, for the most part, people who are supposed to know about buildings know a lot more about building buildings and how they actually work after they're finished. And people often say, well, there isn't much information about, but there's quite a lot of information lying about, but it's not terribly well curated or managed. And unfortunately, the government 40 or 50 years ago used to be quite active in that area, but over the decades they've withdrawn for it, and the professions haven't quite stepped up to fill the gap. So, you know, one again of the richest areas of understanding building performance in use is actually in the heritage sector. Well, a bit of a bombshell descended in about 2010, 2011, when there was a report by government on low carbon construction, which again was thinking about low carbon construction rather than low carbon buildings. And there was also a draft of a Green Deal, which was giving householders particularly money to improve the performance of their dwellings, which would of course include a lot of traditional buildings. And we did a little bit of work for English Heritage at the time, saying, can we develop some sort of risk management system? So you looked at what you might want to do. You could relate that to what the building was like, what the users were like, what the measures might be, and you could judge whether it was something it was worth doing, definitely not worth doing, or something you might take care about. You know, if you did more research, if you took more advice, if you did more measurements in the building, you might be able to get away with it. And so we had case studies of this, and we had 3 buildings which had been refurbished along the top, and 3 buildings which were in the process of being refurbished or about to be refurbished along the bottom. And so the ones along the top had all been done. You can see the ones along the bottom were actually, the 2 on the right were part of a deep retrofit project for the government, Retrofit for the Future. The ones on the left were some in Bristol, which had been severely compromised by interventions over the years. And one could see a great opportunity then for a heritage retrofit to be able to reverse some of the indignities of the past. And the sort of things we found was there were important issues about moisture control and management, which weren't well understood. And also, and this comes up again and again, and I'll deal with it later. There are issues with windows, and interestingly, we found often owner-occupiers were more likely to reuse and upgrade and refurbish things, whereas landlords tended to replace them, not necessarily with something that was better. The other problem was landlords needed to cover all the bases, and so they often implemented solutions which were too complicated for the occupiers and the maintainers of the buildings to look after afterwards, where the owner-occupiers were more able to take shortcuts, which often worked very well. So complication was a big problem on building services, and things that looked good on paper were too complicated and people couldn't run them economically. And in heritage, sometimes there were intrusive things that could have been done more sensitively. But one of the major opportunities was personal engagement, which the owner-occupiers had, but of course the social landlords didn't. So there's a big difference between designing for people who know what's going on and have a motivation to make the best of it, and where you have to design for anybody, whether they are likely to behave in a sensible way in relation to the technical infrastructures in your building or otherwise. And of course, we've seen that recently with a lot of publicity about severe moisture and mold problems in social housing. So about the time of the announcement of the Green Deal, a number of bodies, a National Trust, written on the letterhead of the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, said they were really worried because the government was introducing this Green Deal to improve the energy performance of existing buildings, and nobody in the heritage area had been consulted about it. Well, what was this Green Deal? Some of you may remember it. I called it the Green Subprime Deal because I thought it was very badly put together. But is an idea to lend householders and landlords money in order to save energy and carbon. And the idea was the cost of servicing the loan would be less than or equal to the savings in the cost of energy purchased, as manifest through the electricity bill, which wasn't perhaps very clever. But the whole thing was based on a shopping list of eligible improvements, which said nothing at all about the systemic performance of the building. So if you replaced all your leaky windows with lovely new double glazed ones, but didn't do anything about replacing the ventilation, you might have much damper internal environment. You might have mold growth, particularly on the reveals of the windows. But essentially, the Green Deal saw that as nothing to do with us. Building regulation should take care of that. Not necessarily. And also, of course, people were sometimes applying insulation to saturated fabric. You know, essentially the maintenance needs doing before you want to start any sort of intervention on a building. So this came in October 2012, and at the time, interest rates were very low, and they went for this, so it wasn't a very good deal. And in fact, most of the problems with many people on energy-saving improvements is not money, it's trust. Can you trust the people who are advising you on it? Can you trust the people who are going to do it? Can you trust the consequences? Are we sure that the golden rule will be met, or are we stuck with not much lower energy costs as somewhere and an extra bill to pay? And then, of course, when somebody else came to buy the premises, they said, well, you better get rid of that because we're not going to buy it with this albatross of an extra mortgage on it from the Green Deal. So thank goodness it was scrapped 3 years after launch, not surprisingly because of frustration and confusion for both the supply chain and the end users, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Rather less clever was when the Theresa May government came in, they scrapped the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which of course has been reborn a couple of years ago on the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. But it's not a terribly clever way to run a railway when government's chopping and changing all the time. So anyway, partly that letter helped to get together a group of people who were interested in the performance of traditional buildings, the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Association. And the moving spirit for a lot of that was a colleague of mine called Neil May, who very sadly died prematurely about 5 years ago. And he was a fantastic motivator of a lot of things to improve our understanding and practice in making buildings better. So the first thing, STB actually be able to get some money from the Department of Energy and Climate Change in order to produce this report about the knowledge base for retrofit of traditional buildings under a sort of banner of responsible retrofit. And this was launched, in fact, just about the same time as the Green Deal. So even though the Department of Energy and Climate Change had paid for it, well, it hadn't quite paid for it. There's a lot of sweat equity in it too by everybody in the team, including me. There was little cognizance of it within the Green Deal rules itself. It was very much something that needed to be read alongside it for people with the nous to read it alongside. Because essentially this concluded that there was very limited understanding throughout the market of how traditional buildings performed. Research and guidance wasn't very well linked together. Models and software were sometimes dubious and sometimes completely inappropriate. So what was important was a systemic whole building approach, not a shopping list, and that we might need a rather different way of thinking about things. So the triage process we had, unfortunately, couldn't be taken further by English Heritage after they were broken up into English Heritage and Historic England, but they gave the intellectual property to us, the Usable Buildings Trust, and we, in turn, said to the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Association, you can use this. And this developed this risk management system which is still available on the STBA website, so that if you started making an intervention in an existing building, you could see how it linked to other things in that building. So it allowed you to sort of reverse engineer what is now called a whole building retrofit plan. So essentially, if I give an example here of replacing the windows, I think it was replacing the windows. Well, you better think about the walls because there may be an issue with condensation where you put this in, and you've jolly well got to think about ventilation and what happens in relation to the chimneys you've got and the doors. And by the way, this may also affect the capacity and control of your heating. So you could use this, and then this was cross-referenced to guidance and other things that would enable the professional, though this was actually trialed, believe it or not, on a number of people who had householders, tenants, etc., in North Yorkshire, and they managed to use it and like it with a bit of advice. But really, it was putting the cart before the horse, because it'd be best to start with a whole house approach or a whole building approach, and then you could break it down rather than do it all in terms of, oops, we better think about that. So where are we now? There's been 10 or 15 years of development since these measures and activities. We got a much bigger climate emergency than we thought we had then, and a number of authorities have declared a climate emergency, including our own government, though you might not think so. But also we've seen from the storms and floods and fires and I don't know what, sea level rises, that we've now got a big job to adapt to climate change as well as to cut carbon emissions to mitigate it. And a lot of that, of course, is related to moisture in buildings, whether it will be from more driving rain or recovery from flooding or whatever. But we've been rather poor at tackling energy use in buildings, particularly on the domestic side, where progressive governments after 2010 have actually dismantled most of the schemes which were allowing them to be upgraded. So the insulation industry is now much smaller than it was then. But we've had a lucky card and we've got lots of renewable electricity. But the problem is now we've got bottlenecks in distributing it. And sometimes, both from wind and solar, we can't use it. You know, we have to pay people to take it away and if not, turn things off. So we haven't got a very good overall policy in relation to energy supply and distribution. And of course, we're short of money and the government continues to backtrack. So Lord Deben, as he stepped down from the Climate Change Committee, which he'd chaired since its inception, many years ago now, about 15 years ago, saying, you know, we're failing to deliver and it's the whole system that we're trapped in isn't working. And in terms of the responsible retrofit publication, and I've got an asterisk here to all the things that Neil May helped to instigate, and this is by no means a complete list. We've got much more academic interest in how buildings work. You know, UCL's got its own Centre for Moisture in Buildings. The UCL energy people do an awful lot on existing buildings. You know, Salford's built a whole laboratory which they can put houses in and heat them up and cool them down and use different systems and spray them with rain and the rest of it. And there's much more understanding now that modern buildings are generally based on layers, raincoat type construction, to keep the rain out and the air and water vapor and things that might go through the fabric and cause problems in, whereas most traditional buildings have permeable construction. And the last thing you want to do is put an impermeable layer on it, whether it's paint on the outside or cement on the inside or cement render or paint on the outside or membranes, because things that are supposed to keep water and water vapor out also keep them in. And it's often recovery from trapping is much more deleterious to the fabric than getting wet a bit and then drying out a bit. And we've now got a much better British standard, 5250, which was largely on condensation and is now on moisture management. And that's embodied a lot of the ideas of Neil May and also particularly of the people from Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland, who have done an awful lot of research work in the area. And research projects, bodies like Historic England, Historic Scotland, CADU, National Trust, etc., have been doing an awful lot of work and producing not only research, publications, guidance, etc., but projects on the ground, which they actually understand how easy or difficult it is to do certain things and the sort of results you might expect. And now we've got British standards, public advisory standards on both domestic and non-domestic retrofit. A national retrofit hub was set up last year and is now getting into its stride to support domestic retrofit, both on the guidance side, but also on the delivery side. And the net zero carbon standard, which is being developed for buildings in the UK at the moment, has a heritage group, amongst other things. But the system is by no means perfect yet. And of course, the sort of extreme case of irresponsible retrofit was the Grenfell Tower fire, which has exposed lethal systemic flaws in the way that we procure buildings and work to buildings. So there's an enormous problem because, for the most part, as I mentioned before, the construction industry is about construction, and construction tends to diverge from good intentions rather than converge onto good outcomes. So what we really need is outcome-driven processes rather than ticking the box for inputs and, if you're lucky, for outputs. And the aftermath of Grenfell Tower has sort of led to the Building Safety Act, but that's only a small part of this elephant. The elephant is the whole culture needs to switch over. And of course, again, when you look at the professionals in heritage buildings, they already do that. So recently, when I've been on the heritage group of the net zero carbon building standard, I've sort of been talking to people and reviewing things. And we still find that some people think that, heritage buildings and traditional buildings are unsustainable. We need to do a lot to them. But in my experience, the newer a building is, the shorter it lasts and the more it costs eventually to look after. So rather than thinking of heritage buildings as unsustainable, you should think of them as pillars of sustainability, but they might not be as good as you would like in some aspects. But often they're not as inefficient as people might think, because the models we're using for energy performance certificates tend to overestimate energy use in traditional and heritage buildings and underestimate them in new buildings, with some notable exceptions. We really haven't got very sharp tools for doing this sort of thing. And the retrofit plans, including those under the BSPAS's 2035 and 2038, are sort of focused on medium-term retrofit plans. And they're often a bit short on the short-term stuff, on the quick wins, which is a bit disappointing, because the quick wins can save carbon today rather than tomorrow, and also save money. They also look terribly much as a building as an object, which may be fine for a landlord, but isn't fine for an owner-occupier. It's very much more a system in which the owner-occupier is part of it. So we need much better briefing processes for this sort of thing. We need much more local knowledge on both the advisor and the installer front, both to streamline things and to provide greater insights. And we must appreciate that there are very different perceptions of whether you're a social landlord, a private landlord, or an owner-occupier, which lead to very different solutions, which can be equally effective, but the landlord ones are usually more expensive. And there's a lot that could be learned if there's more coming together for people with understanding of heritage buildings and everybody else. But the information at the moment is not exchanged very freely. Heritage is seen as a bit of a lunatic fringe. So how might we begin to put that right? Well, there's a mantra of fabric first, which for a new building is essential. I mean, the last thing you want to do is use energy for heating, cooling, and ventilation if the fabric of the building can do it for you. And one example of a fabric-first passive house building was the late services engineer Max Fordham, whose house was completed about 5 years ago now. And his ambition, which he expressed to me in the 80s, I think, was that he wanted to design buildings as a services engineer with no heating, no cooling, and no lighting while the sun's above the horizon. And this building actually got the very first zero carbon life cycle green building, UK Green Building Council Award a couple of years ago. But Louis Hellman, the architectural cartoonist, spotted nearly 50 years ago now that heritage buildings could teach the designers of new buildings an awful lot. And unfortunately, the majority of them 50 years later haven't learned the lessons, or certainly didn't learn the lessons soon enough. So we've now got a whole stockpile of energy-dependent heritage, you know, some of which one might prefer to get rid of, but it's our heritage whether we like it or not. So at the moment, the culture is predicated on deep retrofit, where you can get a building with an existing building into a similar performance level to a new one, or at least substantial renovation. But the trouble with these is they're expensive and slow, and they might be risky. And even if you wanted to do them all the day after tomorrow, we haven't got the supply chain, you know, we haven't got the materials, we haven't got the design skills, we certainly haven't got the construction skills. So we got to make haste slowly here. And also, this is a paper by a couple of people in the Energy Institute at UCL, you know, saving carbon really isn't about 2050 and zero at 2050. It's about how we get there. And I mean, all the tragedies at the moment seem to be more likely to be sort of doing something like this and then hoping for a nosedive. Oops, sorry. But clearly, something like a deep retrofit is going to involve a lot of embodied carbon doing the work. And it's slow, so it's going to tend to be, for that sector of the world, being on this sort of strategy. And it'd be rather nice to do some quick wins and at least start on this sort of strategy, so it might have to do something else as we invest later on, but by that time, energy supplies will be more decarbonized. So essentially, the embodied energy in what we're going to do is going to be reduced. And we can do things by a multiplier. So this is mostly related to retrofit, but essentially, first thing is if you try to reduce the demand, that can be interventions to the fabric, but they might be minor ones. But it may be also reviewing, do we really need to do that? Can we avoid waste? Then doubling the efficiency with efficient equipment. Now, fortunately, heritage buildings can adopt most of the equipment that goes into any other building. You know, LED lamps, yes, condensing boilers, normally less, heat pumps, perhaps, you know, district heating, yes, you know, no, very little impact there except getting it there, unless it's some archaeology. And then you start taking the carbon out of the supplies. So by doing fairly modest things, you might be able to get quite a long way. So, you know, I mean, this is a very old illustration from something written on architecture in Australia, but, you know, some of the sort of impact of the deep retrofit, it's got much more sensitive now, is, you completely destroy the character of the building in doing it. Is that necessary? We have got more sensitive ways of doing it now, but nevertheless, what we tend to be thinking about, not in the heritage sector, but from outside bearing down on us, is something that may be much more disruptive than might prove necessary. Or is there another way of doing things? Should we be thinking again about the way we use and inhabit and service buildings? So if you look around the world, we've got an average carbon footprint, including imports, of about 6.6 tons of CO2 equivalent per head. And America and I think Australia sort of leads the field, with about 20. And we're pretty high in Europe, but if you go down to sub-Saharan Africa, you've got a much tinier footprint. But guess what? When Alep does a poll, the people in sub-Saharan Africa are actually happiest in their societies, in spite of all the horrible things that we hear, than we seem to be. I mean, actually dramatically so in some cases. So what if we adopted a people-first approach rather than a fabric-first approach? And by the way, in existing buildings, the best thing about fabric first is usually to maintain it first, not to intervene on it first. Because Elizabeth Shove, who's a sociology, who's looked very much into the culture of various people's social habits, including energy use, find that expectations are much more elastic than you might expect them to be. And there's a whole social history and socio-technical interaction between what's expected to be reasonable and commonplace and the technology available. For example, if we all started walking around in clothes like this, we probably need half the heating in our buildings, possibly less. So could we make them fashionable? I mean, would it be better than doing deep retrofits to commission fashion designers to come up with thermally better clothing that people would really want to wear? Now, if you look back, and this is very, very potted and trivial, but going back, 10 centuries or so before the Enlightenment anyway, most people don't write about comfort except in terms of spiritual comfort. And sure, there were fires. They were largely used for cooking. Heating was welcome, often incidental. But if you go to Rievaulx Abbey, for example, there is one fireplace in the warming room. Nothing else is heated in the whole abbey. Now, obviously, monks do penances and things, but there are totally different expectations, and they didn't die of hypothermia, so they must have been doing something. Here's Charlie Chaplin sticking his feet in a cooking stove, but essentially expectations evolved alongside available technologies. And so you had mission creep supported by marketing into more and more highly processed environments. And Gail Cooper wrote a book called Air Conditioning America that framed comfort as controlled environments. And there was a fight about whether schools should be naturally ventilated and air conditioned in New York about 100 years ago. And essentially, the engineers won over the medics. And then after World War II, passive features in buildings for keeping the heat in and keeping the sun out were actually diminished in order to make air conditioning more affordable. And this is hardly surprising looking at the culture of the American Society of Heating and Ventilation Engineers, who wanted to favour legislation compelling ventilation of all public buildings in accordance with the standards of the society, and, believe it or not, to expose legislation inimical to the services engineer. And this is written down in a publication they only reprinted, 4 years ago. So we've got a strong contingent pushing for technical solutions that may be more elaborate than we really need, because in the past, there were quite a lot of things people used to moderate their thermal discomfort, ranging from wall cloths, which were used by the richest, down to the poorest. There are pictures showing poor people with holes in their wall cloths, down to lapdogs and that sort of thing. So a lot of things you could do to mitigate discomfort rather than to provide comfort. And there are a lot of things that can be done there in terms of a lot of work that's done in the adaptive comfort area about ways people, if they can move around, adapt, open windows, have drinks, sit on a radiator or whatever, can get by with less space conditioning. And sometimes they even prefer it. So we can use these tools today in terms of reviewing our standards, making sure we don't get disadvantaged by drafts, clothing I've talked about, but now we have things like personal heating and cooling systems. I mean, I've got a heated cushion, which I don't use very much here in my office, which means I can have the temperature several degrees lower, and that saves quite a lot on the heating. Responsive controls rather than providing things. But physiologists have discovered that when people are in more variable environments, both indoors and outdoors, they actually become fitter, but not, of course, if there's a condensation and moisture problem. And these can be done quickly and cheaply, so it gets one more onto the lower curve than the higher one. So in terms of deep retrofit, perhaps we should be thinking about proportionate retrofit. So essentially in this table, this is looking for, sort of 80, 100 square meter dwelling sort of costs. Perhaps the deep retrofit's going a bit too far, but what certainly the European Commission is aiming for, and we would have been before Brexit, is something which is more of a medium practice one. But it's possible, and Chris Twin in particular, the engineer's been arguing this, that you could halve the heating energy use for about a fifth of the cost of going for a deep retrofit. So essentially with the sort of 80-20 rule, you go 3 or 4 times as far for carbon saving for the money you put into your building. But this would need innovation in terms of both making a technology cheaper, simpler, and more robust. And the whole process is much more professional and streamlined. Or you might go for people-centered things, which very much started working for people out with clothing and local things, but perhaps providing secondary glazing in places or whatever in order to mitigate really bad fabric performance, which could be quickly rolled out, cheaper still, and would enable you to get more on that lower curve rather than the upper carbon curve. Or you might just do some really simple things. And sometimes these are all too possible, but not widely available or understood. And if we were to do that, you've got some advantages down the left. You don't have to mess around with your buildings so much, but you may need to do a few things. You can get by being a bit cooler, but some people are doing that already because fuel's so expensive. You don't need to be so concerned with air tightness because less heat goes out of the window, but it's nice not to have buildings that are too drafty, so you need to do some draft proofing. And you want to be jolly sure you don't get moisture problems, so you need to take the moisture away at source. And it's particularly useful where people are rattling around in buildings, and so focusing on the individual gives you much more bang for the buck than in a densely occupied building, where you might as well let the whole space go to where it goes, but you might still be able to wear heavier clothing or lighter clothing in the summer. So I think I'll stop here because I think it's time for questions, and I can pick up some of these other slides if there's the time. Otherwise, I can give a cross-reference to another presentation in which I've talked about these.
Excellent.
Could we go over to questions?
Thanks a lot, Bill. I liked a lot the idea that heritage should be seen itself as a pillar of sustainability. Very, very well expressed. Now I'll welcome any questions from the public. So if you have a question, just type it in the Q&A function. If you can mention your name and if applicable, the institution you work for, that's always very useful. We have one first question from Stephen Bradley, collaborator and fan, he says. Thank you for a brilliantly articulate and plain speaking talk. For heritage buildings, we can replace EPCs with a sustainability index instead, and a menu of soft retrofit interventions, perhaps sponsored by Historic England or Historic Environment Scotland or CATO. Who would gain and who would lose if we do such a thing?
Sadly, in the noughties, I worked on display energy certificates based on actual energy use. And these are, of course, available for public buildings, but essentially there's never been any policy support for them. We also proposed a certificate where estimated and actual performance were put side by side. So you had your EPC and your DEC together. Unfortunately, the consultants to the ministry said, no, we do calculations to prepare options. It's not at all the same as actual energy use. They're apples and oranges. So we had EPCs and DECs, which is an enormous shame because the infrastructure was there and incorporated even in European standards. But of course, our government didn't like anything European even then. There was a problem on the domestic side because, in 2 words, the Daily Mail, you know, an Englishman's home is his or English woman's home is their castle. And the idea of intruding on its energy performance made bad headlines. I mean, it did the same in California. But interestingly, there are now techniques available which are being explored where if a building has a smart meter, by putting in a small amount of monitoring equipment, you can get an energy signature, which could give you a good idea of what its heat losses and heat requirements are. So there are ways now of bringing more realism into EPCs, and you know, they may still be an EPC, but they would have some DEC DNA in there, which will allow us to proceed more realistically.
Excellent, thank you. We got another question from John Fiedler, who says, great presentation. How do we address consumer fashion and peer pressure? For example, double glazing may be seen as being modern, trendy, etc. One option could be to use financial drivers, such as no VAT on insulated curtains and draft stripping. What do you think?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, certain people like new double glazing, other people like period features. And I think the period features are a bit on the up, certainly in relation to some newer technologies, because people are beginning to appreciate that these newer technologies are not necessarily the best thing since sliced bread. Not that sliced bread was a very good thing to have, but and also there are opportunities. I mean, one thing I've been working on for far too long and not making quite enough progress is vacuum glazing. So within a 6mm sandwich or a 9mm sandwich, if it's toughened glass, you can get the equivalent of a triple glazed unit. So that allows you to reglaze some traditional windows, though they may still need draft proofing, and also allows new windows to be produced. But it also means that if you use it for secondary glazing, you get even better performance than you would get with new triple glazing. Now, the problem is at the moment we don't have good supply chains for these sort of technologies. There's an enormous problem in buildings altogether that a lot of innovations take an awful long time to get into the market because there aren't people who are going to pay over the odds in order, you know, if people who buy the latest iPhone or whatever for outrageous prices, they sometimes buy the latest technology for their business at outrageous prices because it does something. It's either a positional good, it makes them look good, or it's doing something really useful. Buildings don't have that. So this does need some government assistance to get up the curve, but government doesn't see that. And interesting, when I had conversations with government about it a few years ago, they said, we can't do that because we're constrained by EU procurement rules. So one of the Brexit benefits, if we can ever find anybody, might be that we could have more investment in bringing really useful and sustainable things to market in the building sector. Because at the moment, we've got a big problem with the supply chains. I mean, I live in a conservation area in North London. And guess how much it costs to replace a sash window? Quite a large one, 2 square meters, £6,000. You get a UPVC one for £1,000. The timber one doesn't need to cost £6,000, but we haven't got the supply chains for doing it. You know, you could get a timber window that's been made to standard in a workshop, but it has very clumsy sections and things. If you want a heritage compatible one for a conservation area, you pay an arm and a leg. Now, it isn't rocket science to streamline that, but you need much more local supply and demand chains.
There's a very interesting question from Fleur Gordon, a credited building surveyor at the National Trust. She explains that recently she went in a hotel room and the room had been left at 30 degrees. And I'm sure we've all seen things like that, people using thermostats in a very generous way, let's say. What she says is, how do we really educate? Because there has to be a change and it has to be a cultural change. And I want to add to this question because, Bill, I really liked your people-centric approach. And from the point of view of heritage conservation, it makes me wonder about the elements of intangible heritage that are as important as the tangible heritage when we look at building performance, isn't it? If we lose the practices associated with how a building works, we also lose what made it thermally comfortable in the way it was designed, isn't it? I think that may be related to the cultural changes that Fleur speaks about. Returning to her question, what she says, her question is, how do we really educate? Is this cultural change possible?
Was the hotel room at 13 degrees or 30 degrees?
30.
Right, that's a bit. I mean, overheated hotel rooms are my bane when you go into them. They're nearly all overheated, and sometimes you can't open the window. If you turn the air conditioner on to cool it, that's not very efficient, A, and makes a horrible noise, B, and a nasty draft probably too. I think in terms of cultural change, essentially it's sort of try it, you like it a bit. I mean, it's interesting. I've been working recently with a couple of designers who have tended to do passive house buildings, either new or deep benefit retrofits. And they both, a couple of years ago, bought Victorian terrace houses, which they were going to do an retrofit on. But I'd given a talk on people-centered retrofit, and they started trying it out. And after a winter of doing that, they said, we don't need to do an Enofit. We can get away with much lower temperatures than we anticipated. But our teenage children don't much like where we're going. But I think that, there are a cohort of people who are interested in this sort of thing for various reasons. Sometimes they're at SPAB or whatever, and it's a really good way of saying, can we intervene less? Sometimes they're environmental freaks, or sometimes they're just interested householders. I mean, I know one down the road here, we did a PAS 2035 retrofit plan, blind. And it didn't really suit her needs because it came out too intervention and too expensive, which was really interesting because we were doing it as a trial. But she's now got very keen on the people first approach, having seen that the other way around was not only too expensive, but too disruptive for her. So I think we need the messengers. And the nice thing about the soft retrofit is it's not very expensive to try. Sadly, we put in for a project last year under the Horizon European scheme, which actually some colleagues and I helped to initiate, but because of Brexit, we weren't in Horizon properly then. We couldn't lead the project, and we could only be a docking station because it might be necessary to detach the British contingent, depending how the negotiations on Horizon went. So as a result, that didn't get through. But I'm now trying to do a tiny project, both in a London conservation area and in North Yorkshire on this. But, it's only going to involve 5 or 10 households each. But nevertheless, it's really interesting because I mean, one's in a conservation area and the other's just in the middle of the North Yorkshire moors, but both of them have fairly strong social networks. So it's possible that actually that shared experience could spread within the neighborhood, because I think it's very much start local, go viral these days is the way to get change to happen.
Thank you, Bill, for these thoughts. And maybe on that note, we can finish. There are a few questions that I haven't been able to read aloud, but what we could do is, if these questions could be forwarded to me so that I have your emails, I can send them to Bill, and I'm sure he'll be happy to reply. Some of them are a little bit technical. So those of you who I haven't had an occasion to read, just look me up on the UCL website, send me an email, and I'll forward these questions to Bill. Thank you very much, Bill, again, for the fascinating talk. I think we could be here another half an hour answering questions, but sadly we have hit an hour. It's been very interesting, and thanks to the public for all your insightful questions. The next lecture will be advertised soon. It's going to happen in a month's time. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.